Hey guys, welcome to BP the Bible Perspective, making white people feel good about slavery. Now I want to deconstruct Candace Owens' defense of white people in slavery. But before I do, please like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button on the bottom here. If you don't know who Candace Owens is, she is a young black conservative. And I'm going to say this, she is a part of a group of black conservatives. I have to be careful there because not all conservatives, and certainly not all black conservatives, are all the same. They're not monolithic. But anyway, she is a part of some black conservatives who have sort of made it their effort, and I'm going to say grift, because they make a lot of money off of the in the defense of white people argument. If you watch Fox News, and certainly some of the primetime hosts, they peddle the in the defense of white people narrative. And this is what I mean by this. They hate any type of social justice. They hate the narrative that black people are fighting for racism. They even hate the fact that you even say that there's racism today. They take a very opposite position, that racism is over, that there is no racism, that all of the ills in the black community are the black people's fault, not white people. And that, the Democrats are the party of racism and not the Republicans. We can go on and on and on. So there was a certain group of black Republicans who kind of co-aligned with that. And by aligning with that, they grift off of it. They make a lot of money. Candace Owens is one of the chief. She is one of the most popular young black conservatives today. Her videos get millions of views, okay? And so this video that she produced about slavery, the truth about slavery, again, got millions of views, but it is also some distortions of the truth. And as I said, I want to deconstruct what she says here. So let's do that. Here we go.
And now for a brief history of slavery. Here's the first thing you need to know. Slavery was not invented by white people. It did not start in 1619 when the first slaves came to Jamestown. It existed before then. It did not.
Now, this is a true statement, but it is also not the point. When she says that white people did not invent slavery, well, who said that they did? Now, I would admit that when you go back, when I was a young teenager, we certainly believe that, but we believe that because this is the context in which we live. We live in America. History wasn't presented to me, truthfully, from the standpoint of slavery. In other words, in school, I didn't learn about the Romans, the Medo-Persians, or just slavery in human history. And by the way, you didn't really learn about slavery in schools growing up. Especially nowadays, it's more of an attempt to sanitize America, which this is what Candace is doing, but I digress. But to make the defense that white people did not invent slavery, it's like, if you are familiar with the icon Tina Turner, the music legend Tina Turner. And if you know her story, she was married to Ike Turner, and coming out of the 50s and the 60s, going into the 70s, she was basically, the name of the group was the Ike and Tina Review. And so they, under Ike's guidance, he had a certain music style. They were very popular during that time, but behind the scenes, he was very abusive to Tina. when I say abusive, he would beat her horribly. So over time, she broke away from Ike and became even a bigger star with a different music style than Ike. There was a movie that came out in the 90s called What's Love Got to Do with It? And it kind of told the story from Tina's perspective, how she was in an abusive relationship with Ike, and then how she broke away and became the hit wonder, a music icon, in the 80s. Well, Ike saw the movie, and for whatever reason, he decided to do an interview, and this interview was horrible on Ike's part. In other words, you have to ask, where was his public relations? But anyway, when they're asking him questions about the portrayal, his portrayal, how he was portrayed in the movie, one of his comments was that, well, one of the scenes, show me punching Tina 5 times. I didn't punch Tina 5 times. I punched her 2 times. Now, he thought that was sort of a smart response. But was it? Was it not dumb? In other words, did it justify you? And this is the same kind of argument when you say, well, white people didn't invent slavery, but they sure profited from it, did they not? They brutalized black American citizens, did they not? All right, let's continue.
Start in 1492 when Columbus discovered the New World. In fact, when the intrepid explorer landed in the Bahamas, the native Taino tribe hoped that he would help them defeat their aggressive neighbors, the Caribs. The Caribs enslaved the Taino and, on occasion, served them for dinner. Slavery existed in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The word slave actually comes from the Slavs of Eastern Europe. Millions of them, all white, by the way, were captured.
Okay, now she threw in the fact that the term slave comes from Slavs, which were white slavery. Now, she's already made a case, and by the way, it's true. Slavery before the transatlantic slave, the transatlantic slave trade, was up, and slavery has always been a part of human history. As a Christian, we would go a step further to say the sinful nature of man. Slavery before the transatlantic slave trade wasn't about race, however. In other words, it was about power. In other words, if you were a weaker tribe or peoples, you got conquered, you were slaves. And there were different levels of slavery. There was indentured slavery, there was all kinds. But pretty much if you were the weaker, you were a slave. Or you would certainly live under the threat of being a slave. What is different in what Candace is not portraying here is that the unique transatlantic slave was about race. That for the first time, slavery was directed towards a very specific people. Now, when she says that the slavery, and she's going to even bring up the idea that slavery exists today, I'll get to that later in a moment. What's different about America in its slavery, where its laws, its science, its culture, its religion that targeted a very specific race of people and enslaved them. And that's the difference here.
Captured and enslaved by Muslims in the 9th century and later by the Ottoman Turks. Slavery existed when the Roman Empire controlled the Mediterranean and most of Europe from the 1st through the 5th centuries. Slavery existed when Alexander the Great conquered Persia in the 4th century BC. It was so common that Aristotle simply considered it natural. The slave-master model was just how the world operated in the great philosopher's day.
So then what you're saying, Candace, is that America is no better morally or culturally than the pagan nations. By the way, all those nations that she has listed had pagan gods that they worship. And what you're saying is that the Christian American nation is no different, is no better than those nations.
Slavery existed during the time of the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years ago. As far back as we can go in human history, we find slavery. As renowned historian John Steele Gordon notes from time immemorial, slaves were a major item of commerce. As much as a third of the population of the ancient world was enslaved. Here's the second thing you need to know. White people were the first to formally put an end to slavery.
All right, I'm going to let her finish this. Let me just comment on this ahead of it. So the statement here that white people were the first to formally put an end to slavery. Now, in order to say that, she has to go back to Europe, right, where slavery, the colonization, began. So that when we talk about even racism, that began, the word race and racism and the targeting of the dark-skinned people started popping up around the 14th century. And so while she is saying that the white people ended slavery, that's also like trying to give people credit, the person who started the fire, for putting it out. I remember as a little boy one time I was playing with fire and I had some little gasoline outside and I was on the sidewalk and poured a little gas and I lit it and man, it was a fire. I thought it was, oh, it's cute. But then at one point it kind of spread it dangerously and I ran and got some water and put it out. Now, was I to be commended for putting out the very fire I started? White people started the horrible practice. White people started the horrible practice of racism through the vehicle of the transatlantic slave trade. So when they say that they ended it, there's no, certainly there is no, to me, honor per se in that, because as she will point out, it was one of the bloodiest wars that America fought to end slavery. Let's let her continue.
In 1833, Britain was the first country in the history of the world to pass a Slavery Abolition Act. They were quickly followed by France, who in 1848 abolished slavery in her many colonies.
Now you will note that she's not mentioning America. Notice that that's what's missing in here is the great moral leader, right, of America. Now, America did abolish the import of slavery, I believe around 1820. But you still can have slaves. And of course, that would go on through 1865.
And of course, came the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution. After centuries of human slavery, white men led the world in putting an end to the abhorrent practice. That includes the 300,000 Union soldiers, overwhelmingly white, who died during the Civil War.
Now again, so did you hear what she said? In order to end slavery in America, now other nations did abolish slavery without a civil war. But when it comes to America, you had the bloodiest war to date on American soil. 300,000 people. Actually, I think the death toll was more, 600 when you combine both. Now, what's also interesting is that when she mentions the 300,000 who died fighting for or to end slavery, keep this in mind. These are not people who represent her side of the political aisle. In other words, political Republicans of today. In other words, they fought hard. And what she's not going to mention is that even after the 1865 slavery came the 100 years of Jim Crow. Again, no accommodation here because America has been steadfast to keep its racism.
Saying that this makes white people better than anyone else? Of course not. My purpose here is to simply tell the truth, and the truth is that human history is complicated. No one, regardless of skin color, stands guiltless. Yet today we are never told to consider the murderous Persian Empire or the cannibalism of indigenous tribes of North and South America or the heinous actions under the imperialistic Muslim, Chinese, Mongol, or Japanese empires, to name just a few.
Well, anyone who's taught history, anyone who even reads their Bible, would know that slavery existed. We know of the slavery of the Israelites. But again, that's not the point. What about America? What about America under the Christian nation? What about America? I'm jumping ahead. I'm gonna let her. I'm gonna come back to this statement when she makes the all men are created equal statement.
Instead, we're told that slavery is a white phenomenon. And like all persistent lies, this lie spawns a bunch of other lies.
I would like for her to cite who is teaching this, that slavery is a white phenomenon. Yeah, I'm splitting hairs, but so is she. She's doing this in a sense, to distort the truth. Who is saying this?
On social media, I come across extraordinary depictions about how Africans lived like pharaohs before Europeans came and laid waste to their paradise. I wish any of this were true, but it's not. It's a fantasy. The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other Black Africans, and in many cases, sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors. Whites didn't go into the interior and round up the natives. They waited on the coast for their Black partners to bring them Black bodies. The stark reality is that our lives had very little value to our ancestors.
All right, now, this is so silly because let's really unpack what she just said here. Now, one, it's true. And growing up as a young boy, watching the movie Roots, the miniseries Roots, by the way, which is the highest, I think it's one of the highest watched miniseries of all time, which is also even more interesting why it has not been back on TV pretty much since that time, on regular TV, on that, regular, not regular, but major networks. But what is interesting about this statement, which she said here, about the slavery. Now, I want you to understand this. Now, just kind of keep this in mind here. So, Africans, again, we found out, I did later, that Roots was exaggerated and in some cases fabricated. And yes, it did have a depiction, and we believe this, that white men went over to Africa, and while the blacks were just enjoying their life in their villages, that the white men came in and kidnapped blacks. Like, for example, you saw in Roots how they came in and kidnapped Kunta Kinte. And what she basically said, it's true that they did not have to go into the interior, that it was a business. Slavery was a business. And what you would have is one African nation or tribe fighting against another African nation or tribe. And keep this in mind, that Africa has over 55 distinct nations. I want you to understand that. So when you talk about Africa, Africa is not a nation, but it is several nations. We forget that oftentimes. It's like even now, when you think about the Americas, remember you think about you're talking about three kind of distinct regions. United States is one, Canada is another, South America is another. So you don't mix up the nations either. You don't mix up America with Canada. So that's kind of the mentality which you have with different tribes. They sold off other tribes because they were not necessarily a part of them or a part of their nation. But the big point that she missed here when she tries to again defend or make the white people feel good by saying that we had no value to African ancestors. Okay, that's true. But then what value did we have to the white Christian American nation? See, what value did we have, Candace, to them? If you say we had no value to blacks, well, what value did we have to white Americans who bought us? And if you wanted to even dirty and make the Africans evil, aren't the whites even more, since they claim to be Christians, since they claim to be of a superiority, since they claim to be serving the true living God, since they claim a higher moral plateau? So if I say that I'm better than you, but actually do things worse than you, and as I said, the American, all of the nations that she talked about are pagan nations, serving pagan gods, worshiping pagan gods. So all of those nations that she tried to say that America is no better spiritually, is no better morally. But now we see the same action, that they come and they're buying human beings. Who's better? Whose morality is better? Who can so in this making white people feel good, in my opinion, if they live up to the truth, it's going to make them worse, because they're not living up to any of the creeds and the truths that they proclaim.
Here's the third thing you need to know. If you think slavery is a relic of the past, you're wrong. There are some 700,000 slaves in Africa today, right now. That's the lowest estimate that I could find. Other sources say there are many more. For context, that's almost twice as many slaves as were ever brought to the United States. Child soldiers, human trafficking, forced labor, these are the conditions that currently exist within the same sub-Saharan region where the transatlantic slave trade originated. African bodies are being sold today like they were sold then, and no, they are not being purchased by any country of white men.
Okay, here's the problem with that. You do have white slave trade, white sex trade in America, right? It is an epidemic. The reason why I think this is a wrong categorization here is because in most nations, slavery is still outlawed. Now, though practiced, yes, but outlawed. And again, just so before we, as Candace is defending the high white horse, remember that racism existed in America just up until 1965 legally. So remember, 400 years of racism legally in America. So where did those people go? Well, we still see it today. We still see it in the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers. The Klan still exists today. Right? Racism still exists today. However, here is the difference. It is illegal. In most the slave trade around the world is illegal. The sex trade around the world is illegal. So this is a mute point to me. This is a bad faith point here. Especially if you want to demonize Africans, which she herself will go, oh, I'm so far away from the African ancestors, so why bring it up now? What's the point now? I would concede that a lot of the African nations were pagan. I would concede in history, most of the slavery around the world were pagans worshiping pagan gods. But what does that make America, who claims to be the biblical Christian God? Or serving the Christian God, I should say.
In fact, slavery, by any traditional definition, is exclusively practiced today within non-white countries. But we hear almost nothing about that.
Well, we hear it from people like you who are trying to make the non-white people feel good.
Just like we hear nothing about how slavery was universal until good people in Europe and America ended it 2 centuries ago. Why? Because our so-called leaders, black and white, wouldn't profit from it. Black victimhood is nothing if not profitable.
Now, let me challenge this, because this idea of what they call victimhood, who's preaching that? Now, there are names that they would throw at me. I'm saying cite their statements. When you call Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton race hustlers, well, what are they hustling? The same as you right now. They're doing the exact same thing that Candace Owens is doing right now. She is race hustling for white people, defending and making white people feel good. Making white people feel good, okay? This idea of, if you're speaking a truth, of saying that, hey, here is injustice, here is wrong, are you saying that there is no injustice, no wrong? George Floyd, in which she has spoken out, she's criticized George Floyd, not the police officer, but George Floyd. That was an injustice. Where's the victimhood in that, other than the fact that George Floyd died because the police officer kneeled on his neck for over 9 minutes? That's why. And it was an injustice. So, yeah, don't understand this idea of saying let's preach against victimhood, just like she's preaching against white people. Let's continue.
It elects politicians and funds racial grievance groups. And if Black Americans began to view themselves as partners in the American dream, if we embraced the patriotic spirit that holds all men are created equal,
I got to stop here, and this is so full of baloney. Black people have always embraced the patriotic spirit. It was white people who fought and kept black people down. From slavery, 1619 to 1776. Let me go back and let her say something. I'm going to go back and rewind this. I want her to say something here, and then I'm going to come back. This is unbelievable.
Patriotic spirit that is in the American dream. And if Black Americans began to view themselves as partners in the American dream, if we embraced the patriotic spirit that holds all men are created equal, the patriotic spirit that is our real heritage, then the race hustlers would soon be out of business. And who wants that? I'm Candace Owens, author of Blackout.
All right. So let me just say this, because in that last statement right here, when she says that if Black Americans, what Black Americans is she talking about? She's a Black American. Did she not embrace the quote unquote American dream? Let me say this, and I'll say this again. African Americans have always embraced the American dream, but they were always fought against from white Americans. Black Americans fought in every war. They tried to achieve the Black American dream, but remember, slavery prevented them. Jim Crow prevented them. And even when you had certain towns, such as the Tulsa riots, Rosewood, East St. Louis, we can go on and on and on, where African Americans were thriving, well, what happened to them? They were fought against from white America. You see, this is the distortion. She's trying to make white people feel good, but tell the truth. Just like I mentioned Ike Turner. If I wanted to make Ike Turner feel good, maybe I could say, well, Tina Turner maybe deserved you hitting on her, Ike. Maybe you didn't hit on her 5 times like you said, but you hit on her 2 times, and because maybe she smarted off to you. Maybe if she just embraced being the kind of wife she should have been, you wouldn't have had to hit her. You see how foolish that is? And I do say that is foolish. The fact that she's trying to defend and not talk about the evils. See, I say talk about the evils so we can move on. Talk about how that for 400 years, remember, it took 400 years just for America to finally end the legal racism. That's not to talk about the people who are even alive today that are actively fighting against progress, racial progress. But you talked about the race hustler being out of business. Think about this. Had the police in the George Floyd had done their job within the law, we wouldn't have had a protest. George Floyd probably wouldn't have went to jail, minor offense. He probably wouldn't have went to jail. But instead, you had a police officer who kneeled on his neck. But we can multiply this over and over and over again with police officers who shoot unarmed black people. The fact that Candace Owens herself, when she was a teenager, her family sued the school district that she attended, got $37,000 for racial attacks on Candace. I wonder if Candace gave that money back. Huh? Is Candace a race hustler? All right, guys, that is my perspective. Don't forget to like and share this video. Hit that subscribe button. I welcome all comments, and I will see you guys in the next video.